I'm here with Michael today again, and we are going to be furthering this conversation on idols and icons, which was sort of brought up by the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke conversation. But also it's in line with a lot of the stuff that we've been thinking about with Owen Barfield. And we never did get on with our series on the speaker's meaning by Owen Barfield. So a little bit of that may come in here. And let's just see where we go with this. So do you want to give it a start, Michael? I know you've had some thoughts on idols and icons and what the difference is, and then I'll throw.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember what was the genesis of our idea about having this conversation. Was it that comment in the Vervaeke?
I think it was some comments that you made on one of the in the series that I did on Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke with Mark, where we were looking at the
yeah, but we'd already decided before then that it was something we wanted to pick up. But yeah, I'm trying to remember what it might have been. Yeah, I don't know. I'm lost. But yeah, I think this is kind of a key issue across all these different lines of communication, because it's like it's sort of this dividing line between perception and reality, and what are the limits of human knowledge, and how do we know diagnostically sort of, are we on the right path or not? There's quite a bit that's kind of wrapped up in this that kind of pertains to all these different conversations we've had. It maps really well onto the conversations we were having about Barfield's speaker's meaning, which goes into this polarity in communication between accuracy of communication, which is at its extreme end is like sort of like a pure mathematical sort of communication, and then fullness of expression, which kind of gets to this idea of the infinitude that is wrapped up in these ideas of the divine, in truth, goodness, and beauty.
Okay, so I had I don't know if you'd call it an epiphany, but I had a thing happen this morning while I was looking up one of the verses about idolatry in the Old Testament. Habakkuk 2:18 has a phrase in it that has always stuck in my mind, because it kind of reminds me of television. And the phrase is, of what use is an image that teaches lies? And so I thought, well, it's interesting that phrase is used about an idol. So I went in and I looked up the Hebrew of teaches lies and what that was all about. And interestingly enough, the word for teaches in that verse, and often used for teaching in the Old Testament, is the word that actually means shooting, like aiming at a target or pointing. So keep that in mind. When you're teaching, you're kind of aiming your student at a target, showing them the right way to go, I guess would be what you might say, but it's a shooting metaphor. And then the weird thing happens is that when you, if I can find my notes on this, when you look up, of course, lies pretty much is falsehoods. Also kind of the idea of the wrong target, a deceptive target. So aiming a person's eye in the wrong direction is teaching lies, which I think fits right in with the whole idea of an idol, because an idol is a substitute for the real thing, right? So it's aiming the person off of where their target should be onto something else. But then I got to think about this image thing, right? An image that teaches lies, an image. Well, God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. And I know you and I have been talking a lot about the masculine and feminine. So I went in and I looked at the Hebrew for male and female there. And the word female is, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but nekeba, Neqebah, necheba, probably something like that. But it comes from the word nahab. So when I look up nahab, it means to appoint, to designate, to express, or to pierce, or to bore through with holes, as in to perforate. And also can mean to curse. So it has this like 20 different things that it means, this one word that then is used as the root word that's underneath the word female. So right there in Genesis, the word female is a much bigger meaning than what we typically think of it when we just think of, female sex and the male sex. There's something much bigger underneath that. But that really, that got me thinking about a lot of things. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or if I should.
Well, I mean, this whole masculine feminine thing is man, it's so difficult to unpack, and it's so easy, I think. I mean, I'm always touch it with a lot of trepidation, because I feel like it's so easy to confuse anything you say in this space. I don't know. It seems, yeah, something really mysterious happens. Even like in the creation of humanity, Adam is created first, and then Eve is drawn out of him. So there's this sense in which we are in that creation story. There's already this sort of division or fragmentation of what we are in the male and the female, that obviously we're supposed to some extent come together. And I think marriage is a way in which that we are trying to get back to a sort of wholeness, but even more so, I think it's imaging something related to the church and the body of Christ, and bringing back kind of members back into wholeness. But yeah, I don't know how to. I have so many things to say on that. I don't know that I can pick one to go down in response to that. But that is interesting that like, and Peterson was kind of chastised for this, right, in terms of like this idea of some of the negative connotations of the feminine, right, of being associated with sort of chaos and sorts of those things, and like and I'm not sure, and I don't know, I don't know enough to explain why is it that historically it was the case that gets thrown into the feminine side of things, if that's a kind of a I don't know, some sort of weird artifact of language in certain regions. In that Barfield book that I'd sent you a quote from, he makes the note that specifically in the Aryan languages, which are distinct from the Semitic languages like Hebrew, at least, that there seems to be something where a certain predominance is given to the masculine, and something that associates specifically the masculine with thought and intellect, and kind of this way of he makes the note that it seems like these Aryan languages conceived of human beings as primarily thinking things, and that was actually built into some of the language of the word, like the word for man or men has a kind of connotation with the Latin word to think.
Was the implication there? So I read that quote, but it was the implication there that those languages were kind of the beginning of the deviation from the deeper ground of meaning that was in the old Semitic languages? Kind of moving off.
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, but even the Semitic languages have changed a lot. I don't know. I read this really interesting book recently called the Spell of the Sensual. I don't know if I shared any quotes from that book,
Mm-mm.
but he traces, how one of the key pivot chapters in that book is around the invention of alphabets and how this really changes the way language is conceived and thought of. And I definitely think it relates to this kind of icons idols distinction, because and it's funny because it's and this was the comment I made on your conversation with Mark, was that I don't think the icon idol is like a either orness, right? It's more
Mhm.
like it's sort of a spectrum, and the same object for two different people, for the one person can be an icon and for the other person can be an idol. And part of that relates to, I think, where we're at developmentally, because sometimes we just don't have the cognitive abilities to kind of look at things that are more complex. And so we have a sort of necessarily overly simplified version of the thing. And for us, that thing is an icon of something more. It becomes something we come back to more and again, and it becomes a kind of a scaffolding for building a richer thing on top of it. But with the same token, that scaffolding can, if it's not updated, it kind of falls into disrepair and it becomes sort of an idol. It becomes a static dead thing that doesn't actually, it says in the Psalms, it has ears but it doesn't hear, it has eyes but it doesn't see. It's this sort of dead thing, and our engagement with it actually produces the same deafness and blindness in us.
Well, so we can take that back to what you said about the beginning of alphabets being a change in the way that we looked at language, because prior to alphabets, everything was ideographic, right? Everything was a picture that told people a story or made them think about something, like a symbol, a symbolic. All of those things were previous to alphabet. Alphabet
But
detached.
pointing back to the creation as well, right?
Yeah.
Those pictures.
Yeah, and where alphabets, when they first began, were kind of arising out of those symbols, but now we've detached all the symbolic meaning from the alphabet. So an alphabet is just really a bunch of marks on a page. And an alphabet, I think I go back to thinking about Richard Mitchell's book, The Graves of Academe, where or even Less Than Words Can Say, where he's talking about the absolute poverty of modern language, especially when you think about the way that academic language is, or the way that people write about political issues. There's just a meaninglessness in the way those marks are put together. There's nothing underneath it. And it would be very difficult to take a symbolic language like the old pictographs and say something completely meaningless with them, right?
Yeah.
Everything would have some kind of meaning in it, because there'd be a story there.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. Yeah. And a lot of these words that use quite a bit. I'm trying to remember which of the Barfield books he makes this point. They've been invented like in the last 200 to 300 years. These words of modernity. I think there's a great YouTube video if you Google for zombie words or zombification of words, where it and I'm trying to remember, but there are these words where it's like an abstraction built on an abstraction built on an abstraction is kind of the effect of these words. So that they're useful in modernity because they have this sort of sense of being precise or specific, or but they also, because they get so abstract to the point where they can kind of almost mean anything, and so they don't have any punch. And if you look up that that video, what they're talking about these words mainly in the context of writing and saying, hey, these words are going to drag your writing down significantly because they don't have that connection to the imagery and the sort of presence that you would want in it in a really good descriptive narrative of trying to elicit an imaginative response in your reader.
It just made me think about this quote that I have somewhere here from James Matthew Wilson, who is a fairly well-known poet of our day, I guess. I don't know how much this quote I need to read to get at the thing, but I'll just read the whole thing. It's not that long. It's called The Law of Art. Aristotle's Poetics tells us that poetry is philosophical and deals in probabilities. We approve a story that unfolds in a likely way, and we dismiss those that do not. And that is just to say that we know already that stories have a law to themselves that neither we nor the artist get to decide. Evelyn Waugh once wrote of his characters, I really have very little control over them. I start them off with certain preconceived notions of what they will do and say, but I constantly find them moving another way. So Wilson goes on to say, telling, writing, and reading stories is a way of discovering the laws that govern not just the craft of story, but the actions those stories recount. The nature of reality governs the law of art, and the artist's work helps us to discern the laws of reality. So, I mean, I take that to mean that the nature of reality governs the law of art, but then art reveals reality. So words, when you use words in your writing, it has to, in some way, uncover reality. Your words have to be a window into that, that pokes a hole through the map so that you can see something of the reality. And if we're using words in a way that just continually describes the map over and over and over again, maybe my map is black and white, or my map is linear, or my map is rectangular, anything that you're doing where you're just describing the map, you're not getting through to what's beyond.
Right. And what you're describing there too, that's the hallmark of good science too, right? Is my map actually making real predictions beyond itself in reality that I can, experimentally or empirically validate in some way. And if it's not, then it needs to be discarded. But we do have a tendency to kind of get locked into these sort of mathematical models of the world where we can, I think, poorly think that the math is the thing itself. And even really smart people seem to be somehow, I don't know, led astray by the kind of the seductive nature of that simplistic reductionistic narrative, right?
Yeah. Well, you and I were talking recently about Max Tegmark and his whole idea that the universe is completely mathematical, not just describable by mathematics, but it actually is mathematics. And and
he's very clever about how he sets that up, because he in the clip you'd sent me, he makes certain concessions early on to say, okay, yeah, well, whatever math that we have right now, that's kind of a simpler math that we've found that is trying to get at this deeper math, right? So that pairs really well onto Barfield's The Unrepresented, right? There's something there below that we can't get to. But then he kind of does a real quick shift and pivot where he goes, but we've really just, the only things we haven't managed to, describe mathematically are intelligence and consciousness. And we're kind of getting there already with AI, and, consciousness is probably just, just around the next bend. So yeah, my view of the reality is, it's all mathematical. And he makes the statement, early on that, oh, well, if there's any bit of reality that you couldn't describe mathematically, then my view of the world would be wrong. But, he doesn't, as soon as he makes this distinguishing between the simpler math that we have access to and this other level of math that we don't, I think there's kind of a shell game going on there that even he can't see that he's doing. But for him, a really intelligent person still finds it compelling to say, yeah, it's all math. We don't have access to it yet, but it's around the next bend. We'll have the Rosetta Stone that gives us the keys to the kingdom.
Well, so then math would be one of those things that could be both an icon and an idol, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, and I think it suits both very well. It describes reality so well. I think there's like a seminal paper that's called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics."
Eugene Wigner, yeah.
Yeah, and like it seems uncanny the way it's able to describe things, but it doesn't matter what mathematical model you're talking about. We always end up finding gaps in it. We always find it works for doing X, Y, and Z, but then, going down our path with technology, the technology allows us to see, greater and greater magnifications into these different regions of, quote unquote, space time. And suddenly we're like, oh, now the math breaks down. It doesn't work the way we'd hoped. And so what do we make of that? So, well, there must be another equation that we haven't, factored in here. And this is, again, specifically looking at things like physics, where we have, there's a lot of hard science and mathematical rigor. But when you get to like just the next layer up from it, trying to talk about like living organisms and, the organic chemistry that goes into that. I mean, there's nothing like a sort of mathematical rigor that we could use to describe that, or we would use it to start making predictions, and run, a bunch of really accurate evolutionary models of the world that we could predict things from. We can't do that. So why, the idea that we're just around the corner from intelligence and, consciousness seems laughable to me. Like, well, build a mathematical model of a bacteria and its environment first, and see how well you can describe that mathematically. I don't. Maybe folks are doing that, but I think already we see that as a challenge that's a little bit too hard for us to pull off.
Well, because the funny thing about when you look biologically at something, they can describe what they can see, but there's always another level below that they didn't know was there. And then when they get to that level, it's completely surprising to them as how it works. And then once they see it, they can describe it mathematically, but then there's another level below that. Just for fun, I'm going to bring up some videos that you and I have been looking at because they're so amazing. Well, this is a website. This is the inside of a cell, and this is an interactive site here, digizyme.com. All of these things that are in this picture here are parts of one cell, okay? And you can take a look at any one of these and bring it up on screen. If my computer is working a little bit faster, it'd be great. Okay, so you can see it's interactive. If you scroll over, it'll show you this one is an ERK2. This is a clathrin H. This is the ubiquitin K63. And I'm guessing that once you get inside any one of these things that has a little name on it, the MMP2, inside that is another thing that goes down below that you.
And I think too, what they're focused on here is mainly the protein structures in the cell that kind of form this sort of machinery of the cell, the stuff that kind of does the work of manipulation. There's other layers that aren't even included in this.
Oh yeah, and so you get down below that. Let's see, here's another one. this is this is a bacteria. This can play a little bit of it.
Photosynthesis, the process that fuels plant.
Of course, there has to be an ad. Please excuse me for the ad.
Plant life made its first appearance in simple bacteria over 3 billion years ago.
Simple bacteria, he says. We just looked at the inside of a bacterial cell, by the
Using
way.
one of the world's most powerful supercomputers, scientists have sought to model its chemical secrets. Step 1 is to capture sunlight. Passing through a transparent membrane to the center of the bacteria, we encounter a cluster of spherical pods. Each one is equipped with special sensors designed to harvest solar energy. When a photon hits, it excites rings of chlorophyll molecules. This energy is transferred across a family of proteins, the machines of life.
So anyway, at the end of this video, he talks about how evolution has produced all this. I thought it was hilarious. I'm sorry. That's just a part of it. Now you got to go down one level below that into these organelles. And I have another video of these organelles, which we could show if we wanted to, which shows that each one of these organelles is down below another level. And yet it has all of this electrical signaling going on inside the organelle, telling different parts how to build. And then underneath that, there's another layer yet. And all of those things had to be there before the first cell could begin self-replicating. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand how evolution works in that arena. Evolution works once there can be some selection made, but before the first cell can replicate, there's no opportunity for selection. So where did all that stuff come from?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is the part that, I mean, there's so much, right? There's so much compelling, things that point to aspects of evolution, like in the fossil record and such, right? That we could see, like there's all these transitional species, et cetera, et cetera. But then I just find it, I haven't, and maybe they exist, but if anybody's watching this, I would like to see it. Like, where's the compelling narrative around how certain things that have a certain chicken and egg problem to them, how they get solved by evolution, right? Because it's not just a random, mutation of one pair of nucleotides here, right? Within your DNA, it's got to be like, this thing has to evolve here simultaneous to this thing, or you don't get any benefit whatsoever. Like even when you think about DNA itself, right? Like, did DNA come to the fore first, or then how did, because DNA itself is just a code for something that is going to go build a mechanism or a machine that's built out of proteins based on it. So which came first, the machine that reads it, or the DNA? And neither of those things have value of their own. Like the thing that reads the DNA has no value unless the DNA is there. So like I don't, there, you find that at every certain stage of complexity within an organism, and I just and then even once you go from like a single-celled organism into multi-celled organisms, and how do you get the plans stored up to make this part of the organism's going to decide, I'm going to be an eye, this part's going to be, I'm going to be the hands, I'm going to feed. That sort of it requires so much pre-planning, right? It just
well, that's where this Michael Levin comes in, because he says, and I've heard this before, that the DNA does not tell the body parts where to go. the DNA doesn't explain the structure of the body. The DNA just, as you said, tells the proteins what to do. And something has to tell the different parts where they line up. And Michael Levin, who also he's not a Christian, not a believer. He has discovered this biological or this electrical signaling that goes on inside between different cells as they're differentiating, telling each other where to go. So this electrical signaling is happening, telling them, you go over there and become an arm, you go over there and become an eye.
Yeah.
Where are those electrical signals coming from? They don't seem to have an answer for that. I mean,
yeah. Yes, I guess we've taken a little bit of a left turn into the biological realm as an example or use case, but
it is an example of an icon, I think.
Oh, yeah, I think,
Yeah.
or an idol, depending on what
Yes.
how you look at it, because
Yeah.
because again, like you can line up all these different like things in the fossil record and be like, okay, I have this sort of trajectory I can see in the fossil record, therefore things happened according to this random process. Now, like, and to think that because I can plot them on a graph, I've now done something scientific is, I think, so diagnostically for me, I think a good way of saying, is it an idol or an idol that I'm engaging with, or an idol and icon? The big turning point is whether the thing I'm looking at is closing off data that I can't now see, or if it's opening up more data, like it's opening up a broader, expansive view of the world and the reality that it's intended to model every time I look at it. Or so it's, and I think most of the time, if you're honest, you can see that it's doing one of those two things, right? And we kind of like when it's closing things off. And again, this is kind of a necessary thing that we're doing all the time because we're trying to manage complexity. We kind of like that because it gives us more power in terms of confidence to make decisions, to do things. And we like that level of confidence because we need to make decisions in the world all the time. And so if we're exposed to this sort of infinite amount of complexity that's actually there at any given moment, it'll overwhelm us and we will be paralyzed, right? And so we're kind of, I don't know, we have this temptation, and in a certain sense, we have to do this necessarily, right? We have to kind of have these things that basically function as static idols, at least for this moment in time, and the decisions are going to make right this second. But the only way you can know is if you really, have something that's an icon, is if you come back to it again and get more from it the next time, and more from it the next time, and more from the next time. And at the point when that stops occurring, you don't have an icon anymore. You have something that's decaying into an idol. And I think in some cases,
it just occurred to me that that's part of the discussions going on right now about the way some churches use the Bible, right? Some churches see the Bible as this static, kind of carved in stone.
Yeah, and they're not even really reading it, right? In a lot of cases, they have a certain finely selected group of proof texts that are like pillars for their whatever they have on their website. That's their tenet of beliefs. But if you read the Bible continuously, like you're going to come back with different thoughts of it every time. Like you're going to see something more you didn't see the next time, and that might actually erode one of those pillars. So that becomes kind of a dangerous activity to take deadly seriously. If you want to do sola scriptura, well, that's dangerous, and which the Protestant Reformation has shown us, which is why we have this plethora of different denominations, right? Because you come back to the different texts, you're a different person, in a different time, different place. You even over the course of your life in one body will come back with a variety of different things you see in it. And if you want to at any point enshrine propositionally a sort of idol about my understanding of the text as it is right now, then you're gonna have challenges to that, both from yourself in the future and from other people that are coming from different perspectives. So it's definitely yeah, it's challenging, you know, to
Well,
be
one of the-
honest with ourselves about these things.
One of the things I ran into in looking at the icon and idol thing was I was wondering what Jordan Peterson had to say about idols and icons in Maps of Meaning, and precious little. So I wasn't surprised that he actually asked John Vervaeke, you know, what's the difference? Because when he's using them, and he uses the words only a couple times in Maps of Meaning, and both times he's using them sort of
Interchangeably.
well, not interchangeably, but in more contemporary terms. But as I was reading the one page where he does use the word icon and idol, he is talking about the Great Mother, and the Great Mother. I hesitate to even read this, but these are his words, not mine. Okay, so he says the Ouroboros and the figure of the Great Mother commonly overlap because the chaos comprising the original state is hard to distinguish from the chaos defined in opposition to established order. Two things that have no distinguishable features, as is true for the two domains of chaos, are difficult to separate from one another. An immense difference obtains between the possibility of something unknown and an actual unknown. The difference between potential and reality. So the possibility of something unknown is filled with all sorts of potential for fear, right? The possibility of the unknown means there's all kinds of things lurking out there that you have no idea what they might be. And that, when you talked about how some people are fearful of reading the Bible and letting it open up more and more and more to them, is that they might stumble into something that's, you know, really terrifying, uncomfortable, might upset their whole worldview. And somehow he distinguishes that from what he calls the actual unknown, which he identifies with reality. Now, I have a little problem with that categorization, but I thought it was a very interesting contrast, because the unknown as such is the thing in and of itself. By contrast, the unknown as encountered by a determinate subject in a particular situation is the matrix of all being. And when he says the matrix of all being, he's talking about the Great Mother. But that's where he gets all, I mean, this is where it gets all messed up, because the matrix of all being would be the mother of all being. So that in other words, in his mind, before there is being, there is a mother. So anyway,
That's his conception, I think. Or is that his conception, or is he's just trying?
I think he's
That's
trying
Maps
to,
of Meaning, right?
yeah, he's trying to pull together what
He's
he's
trying to
read
pull
in
the
all these
mythologies
different
of the world.
mythologies and so forth.
Yeah, which the most of the mythical narratives always have the world being constructed out of some sort of pre-existent parts.
Yeah.
Some sort of you know, pre-cosmogonic, you know, goo.
But then he goes on to say that the matrix of all being is the actual source of information that, once explored and categorized, constitutes cosmos or order, and for that matter, exploring agent. And I thought that last phrase, I'm going to read it again. The actual source of information that, once explored and categorized, constitutes cosmos or order, and for that matter, exploring agent. That sounded to me exactly like McGilchrist's idea of the right and left hemispheres of the brain, that the right hemisphere brings in the information that comes from the source, and then the left hemisphere explores and categorizes it, and the two of them together constitute the cosmos or the order and constitute the exploring agent, because our brains, our minds are meant to be exploring. And the way that we explore is this two-part thing, right? But then the left has to bring it back to the right. he has a lot to say about the feminine in that section when he's talking about the feminine being one who promises endlessly, but also threatens absolutely. Because of the connection to the unknown.
Mhm.
Not that women are threatening, but the idea is that women represent the unknown. So I guess you could say in his map, women are an icon of the unknown.
Yeah. You know, I'm curious what your perspective is on this, because, you know, like, I think I said somewhere in one of the notes where we were corresponding that, you know, I think there's definitely something that corresponds between the feminine and in the artistic mode of being, and that because there's something about a real artist that I think we all recognize, or at least it seems to me that if you ever listen to people who are artists talk about their process, there's always this sense in which what they're doing is observing something external to themselves, and kind of just being diligent and patient about bringing that observation to bear on whatever it is they're doing, and trying to kind of be. There's always this sense of like, this is why the language of the muse is always kind of present with most artists, like, and you could say that's just some sort of psychological trick, right, to kind of distinguish yourself from your art in the process so that you can be more in tune with it to some extent, or even in some sense to allow yourself to take more risks, so that, because you're, in some sense, it's not you that's doing it, it's from the outside. But I don't know, phenomenologically, I think for myself as well, I experience this whenever I'm in some, trying to learn something new, trying to articulate something new. There is this sense of trying to listen to something outside myself, that I think is, for whatever reason, is always archetypically represented as the feminine. And there is something very, what you're doing in that space is very, very difficult to give a real formal articulation to, which is why I think people fall back on sort of a personification of the muse or something like that as a way to categorize what is essentially uncategorizable.
Well, while you were talking, the image that came into my mind is this image that we've talked about so many times of the key and the lock. Okay, so the lock is a kind of, I think I got this right from Glenn, the lock is a kind of finite state machine that is already, in some sense, pre-programmed to recognize when the proper key is fitted into the lock. Mm-hmm. And the lock does not allow itself to open unless the proper key is fitted into the lock, right? So when you were talking just now, and I was thinking through the whole artistic process, and then you mentioned also when you're trying to think about something or trying to process an idea, it really is that same feeling. When I'm trying to process an idea, it's sort of like I'm catapulted into another space that's not my own space. There's some other space that I'm catapulted into, and I'm trying to find my way through that space. And when I'm painting, even just take a very simple thing, like, let's say I want to paint an apple, and I'm really looking at the apple, and I have to determine what is that shade of red, or is it even red? Once the sunlight is on it, does it look a little bit more pink or orange or golden? Or when the sunlight is on it, is that even almost a white, or maybe there's a gray in there? And you're kind of in this other space trying to determine what it is you're really looking at, because things aren't what they seem. And you find that out very quickly when you're painting, They just aren't what they seem. But even then, once you've made that decision, now you have a brush in your hand and you have to try to recreate that color on your palette. And you have to figure out where, between where that apple is and where the canvas is, to carry that across that space and get it in the right location. These are all very similar to just the process of thinking, trying to orient yourself as to where does that thought fit, because all of these things come up in your mind. When you hear a thought and you're trying to process it, all the other thoughts you've ever had and books you've read and everything, this whole library comes up and you've got to find out where it fits in there. Painting is the same way. They say that the best way to paint is to try to shut off your left hemisphere, because your left hemisphere is full of all this stuff that says, you know what an apple looks like. It just looks like this. And your left hemisphere will provide you with an apple icon or something, that's what an apple looks like. And so you're tempted to not be looking at the actual apple that you're dealing with, because this other thing comes up in your head and wants to fool you into that.
Yeah, it's the icon-eyeball distinction. Like, are you actually lensing something? This is, again, why it's helpful to personify a thing outside yourself that you're in communion with. Because that's, it seems to me like the challenge in encountering the new or doing the artistic work, right? Because it is work. The challenge over and over and over again is to care with a sufficient level of patience to get past it, because there's always this sort of like boundary of a thing that you're trying to climb over that's resisting, getting the shape right in that key in the lock structure you're talking about. There's always like this kind of built-in resistance or something, some sort of like habit or stickiness towards the status quo, right? That you have to kind of push and get over. And it seems to me as well that like, so that you have to have the gaze you were talking about at the thing external to say, oh yeah, like my representation of it isn't actually the thing itself. It's actually, it's got all this extra detail that isn't in my model of it. And because otherwise, if you feel like you're just copying the model that's in your head, you're like, why bother anyway? Like your interest in the whole thing you're doing just immediately evaporates. It's like, I'm making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Why? This is like, there's no point. Mm-hmm. But there's something in that process where like there's something like, again, there's like a spark that happens and you realize you've hit upon something new. And that spark is what makes you keep going. And like you have the patience to kind of feel your way in the dark for that little next spark.
I remember when I first started painting, I started looking at the world in such a different way, because I'd be walking along on a walk and I'd see this branch of pine needles and I would think all of a sudden, well, how on earth would I paint that? How could I make it look like it actually is? Because if you try and paint every needle separately, it's just going to look static and harsh, and it's not going to have that beautiful grace that a bough of pine needles has to it. And so I started looking at everything in terms of what's really there. How would I paint that? How, and so it changed the way I looked at everything in the world. And I think that's a big part of what it means to start trying to be an artist, is just changing the way you see things. But
and the other thing I would say, like, what you're really doing, and I think we've talked about this previously, that it's not just seeing things. To see things in a certain sense, you have to unsee the way you see them now, which that's the really hard effort, right? You were saying about turning off the left brain, because that's really hard to space. And we've talked about before about one of the ways of doing that is to like focus on the negative space, because you don't have a model for the negative space. So you can kind of trick yourself into paying attention by focusing on the negative space. And that gives you you're able to pay attention to the nuances of that more, because you don't have, like, if you're painting a chair, like you already think you know what a chair looks like. So you paint what's in your head of the chair and not the chair itself. But when you focus on the negative space, that kind of forces you into like this actual looking at what you're looking at, and not devolving into the model. And I don't, it seems like there's some deep connection with data compression here too, because the reason you have that model in your head is because it's a sort of compression of what's out there in the world, and it's exceptionally useful for recognition, right? Because you can easily just look at a chair and all of its manifestations and recognize it as a chair, but it's much less useful for re-representation or it's like the difference between recognition and recall. Like if like this is like one of the big difficulties in mastery, right? Like you can get to a level of like being able to recognize the right answer versus being able to reproduce it for yourself in your own language with your own perspective and viewpoint. That's a much more involved process, and there's something much more life-giving and I don't know. There's just like a dynamism that comes in when you do the second versus the former. But it's very easy, and this is something I fall into the trap of as well. Is I have a very kind of, I'd say I've always had a really good memory, but my memory is so broad and so like thin that I have really good recognition of things, but it's almost like I have too much trivia crammed up there for my own good, and so that it becomes hard to access in a meaningful way and in a lot of scenarios. So one of the things I've learned is that a lot of times I just have to go like for my job, go into a room and just like kind of talk to myself and record myself talking and listen back to it to figure out what do I really know about this, because I feel like internally I know all these things, but I have these models that are really, they're compressions of compressions, and they work well for recognition, but they don't work well for this other thing, which is to imbue something with a life that is actually going to be useful for communicating those ideas to somebody else.
Well, yeah, I totally see what you mean, because I have the same kind of a brain, I think. I mean, my brain is not nearly as good as yours, but it works the same way. I'm interested in such a wide diversity of things that I have all kinds of knowledge tucked in there, but it never really comes out until I'm talking to somebody else and they say something and it brings up one of those little boxes. Mm-hmm. Okay, now I remember what that was. But if I'm just sitting there trying to like write an essay, those little boxes don't pop up for me. I can't access them. So that's one of the reasons why I constantly surround myself with all sorts of resources, because the resources at least will bring those. It's like a Rolodex is in my brain, and something has to pop the proper card into place for me to be able to access it. Where I think other people who maybe are more, they like go into a silo and they go deep, then they have a lot to say about that one thing because they're so deep down in that silo. But then I look at somebody like Jordan Peterson or Ian McGilchrist, and they've done these deep dives into this broad spectrum of knowledge and wisdom. And I just don't know. I don't know how you bring all that together and do what they do. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think, well, I think Jordan's helped a lot by the fact that he lectures on these things, right? You can see that that's really, helped him in terms of elaborating and kind of, I think he's described it this way. It's almost like he has this long kind of sort of chain of things that goes into really what was maps of meaning, but everything he's done since then is really kind of a sort of a filing cabinet within this library of maps of meaning, right? And that, so when he goes to a certain sort of area, he can always kind of, whenever he's looking at new information, he goes, oh yeah, that fits here in my little library. And it's really powerful, but it's also can be limiting as well, because now that it's become so powerful, you're like, what do you do when you come across something that doesn't fit in? Well,
Mhm.
maybe you can't do anything with it at all, or you can't see it even, or you deny that it exists. So, which is something we all kind of tend to do.
Yeah, and I think one of the other limitations is you notice sometimes, and this may be a feature of his current illness, if we're still talking about Jordan Peterson, um, that when he's in some of his conversations now, these boxes will pop back up of things that it's almost like a little self-contained story that he's told over and over and over again, and it just pops up complete. And he tells that same story in every situation
Yeah.
with people,
And but
regardless.
now he only has access to the extreme Cliff Notes version, which may not, yeah, it might not be apropos, or it may not, yeah, it may not, in that kind of cartoonish icon version of it, have really the power that it used to have in
Well,
the more
and
elaborated
I
form.
mean, I think I'd love to have him go back and reread his book. If he would go back and reread Maps of Meaning, and remember his thought process there. There's so much more there than there is in these little Cliff Note versions that he's handing out to people now. But like in the conversation he had with John Vervaeke, some of that old stuff started coming up, and that's what made that so fresh and new, was he can make these leaps of insight that are just amazing because of what he knows through what he's read here. But then when he gets into conversations with other people, it's just the same old coming up.
So I guess,
I wanted to show you something on, I wanted to share screen and show you something. I did a Google search for icon,
mhm.
and
Oh yeah.
there's no religious icons here at all. But I thought this was illustrative of what we mean when we talk about data compression. Because like, look at this icon, you know immediately what that is.
Yep.
This is where I am, right? And
Yep.
so this tells you so many things. It tells you location. It tells you I am somewhere, I want to go somewhere else. Here's the mail icon. Think about all the information that's compressed into that icon, or the picture of the world. You know, that's the amazing thing about this kind of icon, is that this amazing data compression is going on in there. And yeah, anyway,
The other thing I was thinking about when you mentioned, how is icon used in a popular, what does that word mean in a sort of popular setting? It made me think sort of instantaneously the ways in which you could call somebody iconic
mhm.
and an iconoclast in kind of the same breath, without experiencing any sort of cognitive dissonance. Which to me tells you, in some sense, that does seem to be a thing we give a lot of lip service to, is this sort of the iconoclast, the person that's able to kind of break the mold and enter in something new. That's what we like, especially I'd say it's really an American phenomenon, more than anything else, is kind of, rebel without a cause. And I'm, and it makes me think there's obviously a real value in that, right? In terms of being able to think outside of what everybody else is doing and thinking, and we have such a high reverence for it. But it feels to me like it's something we give a lot of lip service to, but it's sort of like, the Bible, we give this kind of high praise to it, but how many people are actually, reading it and doing that? I don't know. It feels like it's I don't know. It's not something we really do much of anymore.
You mean as a society, as a culture?
Yeah, or I don't think that it's hard for me to think of popular figures, on the current stage that I think, oh yeah, they're a real iconoclast. you know.
Well, so when you're using the word iconoclast, you're using it in some contemporary sense that's even beyond what I was thinking. Because I mean,
What do you think? What do you hear when you hear that?
I always thought an iconoclast was someone who tore down idols, tore
Yeah.
down icons.
But I like in a popular context, I associate it with, you know, this is an artist, a fashion designer, you know, someone, you know, a Hollywood actor, somebody that kind of, they break the mold in some sense with what they're doing. Like they're not, they're treading their own path.
Okay. And so then you said you're wondering if there are people who are doing that today?
No, I there certainly are. I just feel like it's something we give it, specifically in America, and I think this has become it through our media and culture. It seems like to have gone around the world. That there's this high regard for the iconoclast, for the like the person, the individual that, you know, the sort of genius that does their own thing, and there's obviously really perverse things that come out of that, right? In terms of it can become sort of its own virtue, just kind of reacting against what other people are doing, that, you know, with no real even aesthetic benefit. But I guess what I was getting at there, I feel like certainly people are doing this, and anytime you touch upon something that, you know, in an artistic mold that feels fresh and new, that certainly somebody's doing that, right? Because again, as we were saying, I don't think you can really produce art without some sort of contact with this this sort of external thing that we're talking about. You have to be in communion with something.
Well, let's go back to the iconoclast for a second. So what do you think excites the admiration of people? You said people tend to admire the iconoclast. What are they admiring exactly?
Well, I think part of it is there's a certain courage, right, to stand outside, right, to say, you know, I think this way is the right way, or this is something people need to see and understand, that, you know, isn't easily for whatever reason isn't in vogue within the current, you know, zeitgeist. So I think we and you think a lot of America's success has been built on that, you know, the fact that we, you know, the economically we allow for lots of variation, and, you know, you have the startup culture and all the things that it produces. So we have we've seen dramatic examples of the value in allowing in sort of promulgating this diversity and this individuality, and this, you know, everybody does their own thing, and, you know, we all benefit in a certain sense from that, you know. But I think sort of paradoxically, while we still give lip service to it, it feels like I don't know, there's way much, it's way easier to copy paste and kind of pretend like you're doing the thing that stands outside the mold when you're not. You think about like all this stuff with the woke culture and stuff, like, for instance, like some of that is trying to tie onto that same sort of thing. Like the weak, the oppressed are the folks that kind of stand outside. Now, of course, they're not doing it voluntarily, but there's a certain admiration we have that it's for the outsider, that it's pulling on. And yeah, I don't know. But you have this thing where, like, even a group that really isn't, I don't know. is it necessarily, like it's outsider status, or it's, oppressed status maybe actually in question, because, there's been such large strides in the way society has been, architected in the last 5-10 years. There's been dramatic kind of changes in terms of culture and shifts. But there's something where we have to maintain a sort of perception of being the outsider, even while you're in the exact kind of center of the mainstream, right? You're really just saying the same sort of rhetoric and copy pasting the same talking points everybody else is using, but all the while you're using this language of, I'm the iconoclast, I'm the rebel, I'm the one that, I'm oppressed, I'm downtrodden, nobody's on my side, it's me against the world.
Isn't that the story of junior high though?
Yeah, there
Right,
is something
you
kind of
wanna
very
be-
adolescent about it, right?
Yeah, you want to be the one that stands out, and so you end up dressing a certain way, which is the way everybody else is dressing, but you can't see it as that, because in your mind you're rebelling against, I guess it's a rebellion against tradition. Okay, now if I think of iconoclasts in the art world, there's been this drive over the last 100 or 200 years, probably forever, but I mean much more noticeable so in the last 100 or 200 years, to be producing something that is different and that tramples on tradition. But
that's become so imbibed into our very air we breathe, so that now it's almost like the radical thing to do is to dive as deep into the tradition as you can go. That's
the hope. but in the art world, what's happened is that in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years maybe, all the other traditions were trampled on so effectively and to such an extent that the only way to be different now is to do something completely grotesque. So that's the stuff that gets into the museums, the really bizarre and grotesque. Like Damien Hurst is really big because he will take a cow and cut it down the middle, separate it into two parts, put one part in a formaldehyde tank so you can see the inside of this cow, this dead cow, and that's art, and that gets into museums. And the crucifix in the bottle of urine, the Mary that's painted out of elephant dung, all of these things are creating problems for curators and museums, because once this starts to degrade, they have to figure out, when we repaint this Mary in order to keep it alive for the museum, are we going to have to use elephant dung in order for the art to be authentic, or can we use brown paint? Or these are the problems that museums face. And then if they're not going that direction, they're going the direction of something that's completely, so I guess the word would be desiccated, like a video of, I was in a museum a couple of years ago, and there was a whole room dedicated to this video that's showing on the wall in a little TV screen. Big dark room. There's one little TV screen over here on the wall. Whole room, you just come in and part of the idea is that there's nothing to see in this room but this TV screen. And what's on the TV screen is somebody had set up a time a camera. What do you call it when it's set up on a, you know what I mean? It takes a picture every 10 seconds.
Time lapse. Yeah,
time lapse camera of cars moving across the field. There's a road, there's cars moving from the left to the right of the screen. That's the whole thing. A video of cars moving from the left to the right on a time lapse. And then there was some writing on the wall about some deep inner meanings, some deep, I don't know, intellectual meaning about this thing. The art world has gotten so funny that there's actually a website where you can go and plug in 3 or 4 words that you would like to have represent your art, and it'll spit out a whole artist's bio for you about what your work means, written in art ease. It's hilarious. I actually did it once and used part of it in my description of my own work, just because the only way you can represent yourself anymore is with all this nonsense language, because there's no meaning to it anymore. It's all iconoclastic. It's just tearing down the tradition. And maybe that's where it comes back to this whole issue of an idol, because an icon is sort of a signifier of a deeper meaning, of a place beyond. But an idol is a substitute for the real thing. Right.
And the iconoclasts come about because they're the claim they're making, right, is that these icons are being treated as idols, right? Which in some cases perhaps they're correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gets complicated, doesn't it? It gets very deep and very complicated.
Yeah, there's definitely not an easy like binary of like, oh, this is good, this is bad. It is exceptionally complicated. And again, I think that's why it's helpful to not try and think of this propositionally, and to engage with the world and engage, and again, whether you believe in the supernatural or not, or you're so minded as to believe in a particular religion or faith, you can see why it still, regardless, it still makes sense to treat reality as personified, and I think when in some of the conversations we were talking about, like wisdom, how wisdom in the Bible gets personified as this feminine thing that you have a relationship to, and I think that's very useful, because again, what is wise to do in certain situation X is not necessarily the same, even though there may be many superficial similarities between situation X and Y, and the right thing to do in one versus the other might be almost exact opposite. So it's having a relationship to wisdom is difficult, and one that ultimately seems to have to be grounded in humility. And again, that's why it's so important, when I think about this sort of diagnostically, trying to figure out, am I engaging with an icon or an idol in terms of these models or these conceptions I'm using as a sort of map for how I make decisions and what I'm doing. The question always is whether or not that map is opening up more reality to me, because that opening up is so crucial to being humble, right? You have to get exposed. You have to have these glimpses of the infinity that you're not capturing in your models fairly frequently, or else you're gonna lapse into the Max Tegmark line of, oh yeah, we're just around the corner from having this all locked up with a mathematical formula for everything. That seems reasonable, that I could make that, that I could optimistically just say, yeah, we're pretty close. Maybe it's 10 years, but maybe it's 25, but we're there. We're almost there. And so you have to be consistently bumping up against the where the models are failing. And so and some of that is just related to actually doing things in the real world. I think that's one of the great things about art, right? Because, or even as simple as Jordan Peterson is cleaning your room and trying to make it aesthetically beautiful.
That's what I was going to say about the wisdom thing, is the doing. Wisdom gets personified as feminine, and the biblical picture in the New Testament is of Christ and the church, the masculine and the feminine. The church is the bride, Christ is the groom. So the church also represents the feminine, and the church is the place where you do. This is the place of action. This is the place of loving one another actively, and the place of living life together, the place of community. That's the doing. And that's where the wisdom gets built in. Wisdom never comes outside of doing.
Yeah.
You can't just get wisdom from reading a book. You can get some knowledge from reading a book, and then when you try to live it out, you find out whether or not that knowledge is useful, and then it becomes wisdom.
Right. Like in Matt and Mark's recent conversation where they talk about, learning your center of balance in a martial art. And, the best way to do it is just to have, the newbie get pushed over and over and over, like he gets knocked over and over. And after a while, he starts figuring out, okay, here's 100 ways not to stand and have it your balance of center, right? Be centered, right? So you learn very quickly, these are all the ways you're going to fail trying to do that. And that's how you, in practice, I think that's how most people build out their map of reality. It's through consistent failure, and you mainly learn what not to do. Again, that's sort of that negative space, right? We're much better at seeing the negative space than seeing what's actually there. We kind of map out, this is the area where you don't go. And eventually, after you do enough of that for a long enough time, you go, okay, well, it seems like the way you should go is is over here somewhere. But
it also does make me think that maybe this is one of the reasons there's such a focus in the scripture on being obedient to your parents, being obedient to your leadership, because if a mother has much to teach a child, and if the child is obedient, then they're going to learn a lot faster. They're not going to have to learn 100 ways not to do something before they learn the way to do it.
Yeah.
And then there will come times in their life when they have to go through the 100 times, but at least they'll have a foundation on which to build.
That's a really great point, because that's the thing about there's certain mistakes you can make early on in your life that will kind of mess up the rest of your life so much that you'll never even have the chance to have the sort of autonomy to have a passion and go make a bunch of mistakes that, are of less consequence, because you actually have this sort of rigor and the depth of resources that you've built up into your life that you can actually survive some real failures. So yeah, that's a really great point around, you have to, if you want to abandon tradition completely, you're going to be in a rough shape.
Yeah, well, when I was thinking about the feminine this morning, I was also thinking that every person's first entry into the world, their first experience with knowledge is the knowledge that they get from their mother. Even if it isn't anything the mother says, their first knowledge is someone loves me, someone is caring for me, someone is nurturing me. I am safe in this person's arms. That's a knowledge. And that, I think that's probably that right hemisphere of the brain is gathering in that knowledge too. And then that leaves room for the left hemisphere of the brain to start to process the knowledge and do something with it. But that's every human person's experience. First knowledge is through the nurturing and caring of the feminine. And maybe also, and all of us as mothers fail sometimes, sometimes we fail, we get angry, we get short-tempered, whatever. They're also learning that through the mother, so that may be where that first map comes in of chaos and order, or of the chaos and of the nurture, both sides of the feminine that come to every human person.
Yeah. I think Jordan talks about the mother is kind of the center of the infant's world. And so he's, in terms of exploring, he's going away from that center of safety and comfort and, the known, where he can be cared for, and trying to figure out, how far away can I get from that center and still be safe.
Yep. There is this thing in the speaker's meaning on page 29, where he's talking about, well, first of all, I like he's talking about the difference between the lexical meaning and the speaker's meaning, which we talked about before, meaning the meaning of the words versus how that meaning impacts me differentially because of what's inside of me as a person and my inner life.
You said page 29?
Page 29.
Okay.
And he's talking about the different proportions in the relation between lexical meaning and speaker's meaning. And I like that word proportion, first of all, because I think that's the issue with all these binaries. It's a matter of proportion in any of the binary issues. But a little later on the page, he also says, he's talking about, okay, the different proportions between the lexical meaning and the speaker's meaning. So trying to figure out how much of something is figurative language and how much of it is just actual meaning. And he says, I spoke just now of looking through one sense of a word to another. And I suggest that what is most characteristic of figurative language as a whole is precisely this translucence. So he's talking about words, the capacity of words to become icons. You can look through a word and see something beyond. And that's what poetry does. So poetry is, in that sense, I guess you would say poetry is iconic, which is probably what Jordan Peterson picked up on when he said art is the icon, right? Art is the icon and propaganda is the idol. That was his framing.
Right. And that's moving you towards that sort of fullness of expression, right? So it's like this sort of moreness that you can always come back to and find more where you just had looked previously.
Mm-hmm.
Versus
why some poems can live on and on and on, and you get something new out of it every time you hear it.
Whereas the extreme example he gives for the accuracy of communication is like, here's the Cartesian coordinates for some object in space. You come back to it and you don't really get much out of it on repeated viewings, you know.
Well, it's funny that you said that, because one of the things I sent you last week was a Mandelbrot image, that video of a particular Mandelbrot that went, you know, these Mandelbrot things now go deeper and deeper and deeper into the Mandelbrot until some of them last 2 hours. You can keep watching it go further and further down that rabbit hole. But some of the Mandelbrot images that show up on Twitter just have the Cartesian coordinates, the designation of where it is in the whole map of the Mandelbrot, and it'll be a static image. But even that static image, if you could explore it with a screen that could just blow it up larger and larger and larger, you'd keep finding deeper and deeper and deeper. You'd never run out of things to look at in just that one image of a Mandelbrot. So I think even when we have the Cartesian coordinates, it's a matter of looking more deeply each time that you look. You know, they can find coordinates of some little segment of space, and then as they look further and further out into that and deeper, they find things behind and behind and behind, or underneath, like in the cell. That video that Jordan Peterson shows of DNA being replicated, that is going down about as far as we can think about going down. And even that is so amazingly precise and beautiful.
Yeah. Mandelbrot is really interesting. He was a real outsider in mathematics. And I guess for whatever reason, he had I think he had maybe some learning disabilities or something like that, or maybe his situation growing up was a little, I know I think he was in France during World War II. And so he had some issues, but I guess getting into the entrance exam to get into college, he didn't know algebra, and so was like really struggling with the entrance exam. But he had such an advanced understanding of geometry that he was able to somehow conceptualize the algebra problems within a geometrical framework and solve them that way. Is the only way that he passed, and actually, I guess he did really well even. But you know, I really like the fractal as this kind of representation of what we're talking about with the icon and the idol, because you know, there's what you see is that as you zoom further and further in, you see certain patterns that show up again and again. And and I like this because for me, it's a really helpful way of saying, let's say that Max Tegmark is right, and that there's some ultimate math. We don't have access to it. We have simpler versions of it, but there's some ultimate math algorithm out there. But it is of this sort of infinite complexity that you can witness firsthand in a Mandelbrot set, and as you zoom in. And what I like about it is, you see patterns repeat, but they're not identical. And so what that means from my perspective is, yes, we come up with these sort of models of things because we exist at this certain scale of reality, right? And so what fits into our imagination, our conceptions, et cetera, is only going to be of a certain type, right? It's got to fit within the context of just my space as a human being. And for me to communicate it to another academic, that has to compress it even further, right? So it doesn't just have to live within my life. I have to be able to communicate it within a reasonable amount of time that somebody else will even listen to it, right? Whether that's in a paper or however else. So there's all these compressions that are happening that necessarily form in rather very stringent ways limit what we're able to talk about and communicate. Nevertheless, it's sort of a miracle that we're able to find patterns that nevertheless, in remarkable ways, describe realities at scales that are like infinitely larger than that, right? And I think that's sort of a miracle of the way reality is constructed, that we're able to do that at both the large scale and the small. We can find these sort of patterns that are effectively able to model them. But I think the lesson from the fractal is that it's not the exact same. And you're never going to find. You might find a better and better model, but you're probably never going to find the model that gives you the whole shebang. And that's sort of this I don't know, necessary lesson that we need to learn. When you're a little bit too confident that your model describes the thing in itself, then it's become an idol, and you need to go do something else for a while and kind of allow your wonder to be kicked up into another gear, so you can actually start seeing a little bit more of the reality that's being hidden by that idol you're staring at.
That sounds like a great place to end. This has been really a wonderful tour through a lot of different thoughts and ideas, and I hope we can get back to doing this series here.
Yeah,
because I think we only got to chapter 1, and
we did chapter 2 too, I think, right?
Okay, well, so I guess that's why chapter 2 is where my underlining ends.
Yeah, I would be glad to finish it up. I think there's only like 4 chapters in total, so it's definitely doable.
Well, let's do it. And I had been wanting to do some reading about idolatry from this book for our talk today, and I couldn't find the stupid book until about 2 minutes before we got online.
Is that Saving the Appearances?
Saving the Appearances, yeah. So I want to go back and reread this one, and maybe we can throw those two together a little bit. But yeah, let's
Definitely.
do it. Good.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Same here.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye, Karen.